Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another Oh Yum 101 live stream. And this one is a bake along. If you got our community notes right here on Oh Yum, or you follow me on social media, I provided all the ingredients to make fudge brownies. It's kind of nice to do a recipe now and again that is really all about the decadence. And I think what I love most about brownies is the smell of them baking. It's all about that chocolate intensity. So now I know we get very personal when it comes to brownies. There are lots of different types, and I find some people like them cakey, some people like them fudgy. And I'm just going to hit refresh on my screen here as we get rolling. There we go. We're good. I see myself on the screen, so just double checking. We always want the technology to work for us here so that you get all the valuable tips and information right here on Oh Yum. And we're advancing our technology. So hopefully when you see me next week, I won't have these in my ear. We're going to get a nice little lav mic. So we're stepping it up. We're learning and growing along with you right here on Oh Yum 101. Now, is that a mouthful and I haven't even started cooking yet? I better get right into these chocolate brownies because I think I need a little sugar. Um, Lots of great questions. I love getting all of your questions, and I have written down some specific ones. And we're going to have time because this is a live bake along in between each steps and as the brownies bake to handle lots of your other questions. So thank you for watching around the world. And this version of fudge brownies, because I have a lot of brownie recipes, and it really depends on that taste and texture I'm after. Is the crackle important to me? Is it not important? What flavors do I want to build in? So we're going to cover all the different ingredients, how they work in making a really good brownie. But I'm going to actually start by making one of my favorite add-ins because brownie is the base, but you can add tons of different flavorings. Who here likes nuts in the brownies? Walnuts or pecans? Michael's running the camera and he's nodding his head. So I know he's going to like the salt butter roasted pecans that I put in this recipe. Now you could just put in raw pecans or raw walnuts, but this little extra step of salt toasting the nuts brings out the flavor of the pecans. It makes them taste more buttery. And it sweetens the nut flavor a little bit. And that contrast of the salt against the sweetness in the brownie is phenomenal. So you don't really have to weigh out this ingredient, but about a tablespoon or 15 grams of butter. Salted or not, it's up to you. And I'm just going to heat and melt that butter on medium heat. And I've got 100 grams of pecan halves. Like I said, this could be walnuts. It could be sliced almonds. I would say that if you wanted to use almonds or hazelnuts in your brownies, because they're a crunchier nut, they're a little firmer, then you will want to chop them up before you use them. But a soft, tender nut like a walnut or pecan can go right in your pan and you don't have to chop them up. There we go. And I just add a pinch, about half a teaspoon of flaked sea salt. You could use fine sea salt if that's all you have. What you will find when you're making these salt toasted pecans is that the salt won't dissolve because salt doesn't melt in fat. So you would have to add a liquid, and we don't want to do that because we want to toast up the pecans a little bit. So I'm giving them a little stir here just to make sure they get coated with the butter. And I find the little bits of salt kind of get stuck in the crevices of the pecans. And even if you're not making this brownie recipe, the salt toasted pecans are delicious all on their own, but they also make a great topper to a salad, or even if you're making a fruit dessert and topping it with whipped cream or ice cream, a little sprinkle of those on top is absolutely delightful. If you're just joining me now, we're making fudge brownies live. And who here is baking along with me? So I'm really taking my time step by step. So if you have to run to the fridge to get an ingredient, or you realize you forgot something, or you're measuring as you go, we're going to walk through it step by step so you have time. And if you're just catching this, or because if you're watching in Southeast Asia or Australia, I know it's getting really late there, you can always come back and watch this full live stream if you can't stay up because maybe you have to go to work tomorrow morning. Time to go to bed. So I can immediately smell the aromas of the melted butter, and the pecans are starting to toast up a little bit. Now, I find this takes about 8 minutes. So in the meantime, I'm going to cut off another little piece of butter, and let's use this time to get our pan ready. And this is a great opportunity to talk about pan choices when it comes to making brownies. I've got a 9-inch pan because that's simply what I have on hand. You'll find there are instructions on the bottom of this thread that include using a brownie pan, and that's got individual squares. If you like a crunch or a crusty outside to your brownie, that's a good choice. This will work in an 8-inch square pan. If all you have is a round pan, yes, you can make brownies in a round pan and you just simply cut them into wedges. You can use a muffin tin if you wish. What is difficult is if you get smaller than this size. If you have a loaf pan, which is essentially half the surface area, then I would cut the recipe in half. Because if you have a brownie batter that is too high, it just won't cook through the middle, as much as we love a fudgy brownie. Give these a quick stir. Now, I know that we had someone ask, Aura was asking about using a glass dish. And you can use a glass dish when baking brownies. And if you joined me for my Pie Dough 101 last week, I talked about why I like a glass pie plate for a pie crust, because it heats up really quickly and conducts the heat, and it holds the heat. So when you're baking something like a brownie, I would reduce the oven temperature if using a glass dish, because you will heat up the sides of the brownie and cook it before the inside has had a chance to fully set. So a 25-degree Fahrenheit or 10 degrees Celsius reduction will make a big difference if you're using glass over metal. Silicone will work, but you'll probably want it on a baking tray anyhow. Silicone does not conduct the heat. So you'll see I'm just loosely buttering my dish. And that's only because I just am using the butter here to get my parchment to stay in place. And if you see me going back, I'm just keeping an eye on the pecans, giving them a toss now and again. And I'm going to use my sense of smell. When I can smell that toastiness of the pecans, I know I've hit that perfect roasted flavor. I've already cut a square of parchment, and to line the bottom and sides of the pan so that they're easy to pull out and cut on a cutting board, as opposed to trying to cut the brownies in a pan, and you risk actually, if you've got a nonstick pan, you don't want to scratch that surface. I have an easy trick. Using one single piece of parchment, I fold it in half. I fold it into quarters. And then I just loosely hold that center towards the center of the square pan. And using a pair of scissors, I cut a notch a little bit further in from that outside edge of the pan. Then when you open the pan, or open the parchment, you've got this piece with the notches in the side. Drop it in, and you have this beautiful overlap in the corners that snuggles in nicely. It covers the corner of the pan, so that way you won't get any leaking of batter. Let me tell you, it makes cleaning up a snap, and it's easy to pull out, and you're not using excess parchment paper. So I can set that aside because I don't need that right away. And let's go back to our pecans. Now, if you're baking along with me, is anyone else doing the salt roasted pecans at the same time? I hope you are, even if you don't plan on using them now. I'm getting that good buttery aroma. So I think I will take this off the heat and just set it aside to cool for just a few minutes. That way, the nuts are soft when they're warm, and once they cool down, they get crunchier, and it'll be easier to chop them. So now it's time to get into the heart of making the brownie batter. If you've looked up a lot of brownie recipes, there are so many out there. Some use just cocoa powder. Some use just chocolate. Some use a combination. I'm a big fan of using both. I find I get the chewiness and the intensity and the nice soft texture using the melted chocolate, but the cocoa powder adds that extra chocolate oomph. So if you like an intensely chocolate brownie, you want to use that combination. But really, I find butter is at the heart of a good brownie recipe. So I'm going to weigh 285 grams of butter It doesn't matter if it's right from the fridge. It doesn't have to be diced a particular way because it's going to get melted with the chocolate. If you're using volume measures, that would be 1¼ cups of butter. I'm using unsalted butter because I salt roasted the pecans and they're going to get added to the brownie batter. If you are not adding the pecans, yes, you can actually use salted butter in this recipe if you wish. Brownies are not meant to be as fussy as something like choux paste or pie dough or croissant dough. You should be able to think about making brownies. 10 minutes later, start making the brownies, and 20 minutes later, be pulling those brownies from the oven. That is a lot of butter. And actually, a lot of you asked questions, and I'm going to get to the reason why this is a lot of butter. That is actually too much butter. There we go. The reason no, we're going to talk about butter options as in case, because I had someone asking about coconut oil, which is definitely a viable option. Margarine, I typically steer clear of because it can bake unpredictably. But if you know you have a margarine that works for you, that's fine. But I really favor using the butter here because what it is replacing is the cocoa butter that is in my chocolate. So you'll notice this recipe calls for 4 ounces or 120 grams of unsweetened chocolate. Not only is this chocolate unsweetened, it has no added fat. This chocolate is 100% cocoa solids. If you were to try and eat a piece of it, it would be a little disconcerting how bitter and strong. It would almost be like chewing on coffee grounds. Okay, I haven't tasted unsweetened chocolate in a while. Should I? Yeah, okay. How could something that's so delicious in desserts taste so horrible? It really, I get acidity, I get bitterness, I get a graininess. And part of what makes other chocolates, bittersweet, semi-sweet, milk, and white, so palatable is that combination of added sugar, dairy, and cocoa butter to it. So milk chocolate earns its name because it has milk added to it. White chocolate has the complete absence of cocoa solids. It is simply cocoa butter with sugar and a little vanilla added to it. The dark chocolates have a certain percentage of this cocoa solid mass mixed with cocoa butter, a little bit of sugar, and sometimes a little bit of vanilla. So the reason, and I'm glad TJ asked, in case you haven't met TJ, and I know a lot of you have, he's our fantastic channel manager working remotely, making sure all these great questions get to me. We need to replace the cocoa butter that if you were using a bitter or semi-sweet chocolate would be in this recipe. Now you'll notice in the ingredient list I gave you, I did allow the use of bittersweet chocolate. If you can get 80%, that is ideal because sometimes unsweetened chocolate can be hard to find. And so yes, you can use bittersweet chocolate without changing the recipe. You might find it tastes a little bit sweeter. But in terms of richness and balance, it's still usable. What you can't substitute in is semi-sweet milk or white. It just becomes too much about the sweetness, not enough about the chocolate intensity. So you'll notice I have my butter starting to melt on low heat, and it's on direct heat. When you're working with unsweetened chocolate or even bittersweet chocolate that has such a high cocoa solid content, it is less fragile than melting a delicate semi-sweet milk or white chocolate that you would normally melt in a bowl over a pot of barely simmering water. As well, because of this large quantity of butter, that too protects the chocolate as it's melting. So just over low direct heat, you can add this chocolate in, and we're just going to gently stir until everything has melted. The low heat is important. Chocolate always loves a gradual temperature change. Now, this style of recipe, you can't use chocolate chips like baking chips or coating chips. You do need to use baking chocolate. So that is very important. I'm going to take a little peek at some of your questions coming in now. Just so I can, oh, hello from Cape Town. Can you reduce the butter for use with semi-sweet chocolate? Sue, that's a great question. I would say yes. I can't give you an exact measurement. I would reduce it though by at least 60 grams. That's a quarter cup. And I think you would find you have a good end result. Because it is true, you don't want a brownie that is greasy or heavy tasting. And this is why temperature is very important as you're combining your ingredients. So if you're baking along with me, making these delicious fudge brownies, this is why we don't want to let the chocolate get too hot, because then all of a sudden we have to let it cool so that we're combining ingredients of a like temperature to achieve that nice texture. If you've ever baked a brownie and it comes out kind of crumbly, that may have been because your ingredients have separated. Because we throw a lot of butter and a lot of sugar and a lot of chocolate together, and plus combining all the eggs. And one of you asked a very good question. Nisa asked about how many eggs are in the recipe, because some call for 2, some for 5, and that can really change the texture of the recipe. And I'm going to get to that when it comes time to add those eggs. But right now, I'm just gradually stirring the chocolate and the butter together. Butter melts at a higher temperature than chocolate. So that's why you're usually left with a nice smooth mixture with just a couple little butter bits in there. If you have extra time, once you get your butter and chocolate about 3/4 of the way melted, you can actually take it off the heat and just let the residual heat of the melted mixture finish melting the chocolate for you, and then it gradually cools it down a little bit. It's just satisfying to look at melting, shiny, glossy chocolate. And this looks, again, so delectable, you think you want to take a bite? Remember, there is not a stitch of sugar in this. It would be so bitter and strong. Well, I'll take a moment to say hello to my usual crowd. I see lots of you coming back to join me every week, and I'm so grateful. I always have to say hi to Mom, Dad, Michino, Bonnie down the street, Suzanne, whose birthday was yesterday. Happy birthday, Suzanne. T, Kathy, Renu, the whole gang. And so many viewers from around the world. This is absolutely fantastic. Oh, Carol is asking the question, and Cherry asked this too. How do you get the shiny crackle on top? That usually comes from the point when you beat in your sugar and butter. You can beat your sugar and butter separately. It isn't always a guarantee. The risk I find when it comes to getting that crackle, you need to beat the butter, or sorry, not the butter, the eggs and sugar together. If you whisk those together, you'll get some volume into the brownie. The risk is, yes, you may get the crackle, you may overinflate your brownie and lose the fudgy character. So it's a bit of a tough call. We'll see what I can accomplish, because these are going to go into the oven, bake in real time while we have a little visit, talk about your baking questions. And then come back and pull these brownies out of the oven. Fortunately, I did make one ahead of time so we can actually slice into them. I also want to show you about how you check the doneness, because I see a lot of you are interested in how do you assess when a brownie is done. And I've seen a few of you are asking, can you use margarine instead of butter? If you're more comfortable using that, then you should use that. Depending on the country where you live, the products can vary. You know from following me on this channel that I am a butter girl at heart, but I want you to use what is comfortable to you. I would watch when it comes to, if you're going to use margarine, the salt content can be quite dramatically different. So if you can buy unsalted to bake with, then I think that's a better option for you, if that's a little bit of guidance. But you'll find you'll get, because we've got so much chocolate in here, you will get the necessary set you need. All right, my chocolate is melted, so it's going to come off the heat. And guess what? Normally, I would continue mixing this entire recipe in this pot. Why make extra dishes? That's part of the joy of brownies, is keeping it actually simple and contained. But I want you to see everything I'm doing. So I'll transfer this to a bowl. Scrape out every bit of chocolate goodness. And now I'm going to take advantage of adding the sugar now to cool down my chocolate. So if I were to try adding eggs to this mixture right now, I might risk separating the entire mixture because of the temperature change. But because semi-sweet and bittersweet chocolate are made up of cocoa solids, cocoa butter, and sugar, adding the sugar now doesn't disturb or bother the chocolate. So you'll find you won't get a splitting or separation. And actually, I'll pull back my scale. So I like to use a combination of granulated sugar for just the simple sweetness and a little bit of brown sugar to lend that kind of caramel taste, a bit of moisture, and a chew. And if you're watching me from Southeast Asia, if you love baking with gula melaka, the coconut sugar, to explain to those who are not from Southeast Asia, oh my gosh, gula melaka is a really rich, kind of caramel tasting coconut sugar. That would work beautifully in place of the brown sugar in this recipe. So I'm adding 200 grams, the equivalent of 1 cup of granulated sugar. And those of you who are baking with me, are you at this point too? You've got your chocolate off the heat, adding your sugar to cool it down a little bit. And I've already measured my light brown sugar. So light brown sugar in North America is actually fully refined, and then molasses is added back to it to give it that moisture content and color. So we usually have light and dark brown here. If you don't have brown sugar on hand, you can use the granulated white. And then for this amount, which is 150 grams, add just less than 15 grams of molasses, fancy molasses, and you've created your own brown sugar. Or if you get to your brown sugar jar and you find out that you haven't been baking in a while and all of a sudden it got kind of dried out and firm and you can't use it, that actually brings up a point. While you're adding and whisking in your sugars, there's nothing technically complicated here. We're just going to give this a stir and give the sugar a chance to kind of cool down the chocolate a little bit. You'll see that the sugar will not dissolve fully into the mixture, and that's just what's supposed to happen. So let's talk about light brown sugar. If you get to your canister and you find it's dried out, you've got some timed fixes. So if you need that quick fix because you want to get these brownies in the oven right now, what you can do is measure as much of that sugar as you can or break it into pieces, pop it in the microwave for just 10-15 seconds. It'll soften it up so you can measure it, use it right away. For an overnight fix, take an apple slice or another fruit along those same lines. Put just that apple slice in your brown sugar container, seal it again, and within 24 hours, that moisture from the apple will rehydrate the brown sugar. Just remember to pull that apple slice out. You don't want to leave it in there. And then the long-term fix, I store my brown sugar in a terracotta crock like this, and it stays moist. Or if you've got any sort of clay pot piece, it could be the bottom of a flower pot, something like that to store even just a small piece of it in your brown sugar. It helps keep it moist for months, in fact. All right, so we've got our sugar mixed in there. Now it's time to add the eggs. And my recipe calls for 3 large eggs. And you'll see some recipes, and it was Nisa had pointed out, I see recipes that call for 2 eggs, some that call for 5 eggs. The more eggs you have, I find indicates a recipe that uses more cocoa powder for flavoring. Because melted chocolate itself has such a nice setting capability, I find those recipes tend to have fewer eggs. Neither more nor less eggs will guarantee a crackle, but I do find the more eggs you have, the less likely you are to get that perfect crackle, simply because if you're using the melted chocolate, that combination of melted chocolate, sugar, and eggs really helps give you the crackle. Before I add my next egg, I'm going to whisk this in. So we're going to try for the crackle and really give this a good stir. Honestly, I'll find sometimes I get the crackle, sometimes I don't. So you'll see at this point, it's not really smooth, but stay with me. We're gradually introducing a new ingredient to our chocolate. And chocolate's a bit of a princess when it comes to baking. It always has to take all the attention. There we go. It's thickening up, but becoming nice and smooth at the same time. Nice and glossy. So we know we've got a well combined combination of ingredients. The last egg goes in. Now, what I have found, I've seen a lot of recipes call for making brownies using electric beaters or a mixer. I tend to steer clear of that because you might think, oh, well, that'll guarantee I get the crackle. I find I have a tendency to overmix using electric beaters, and then all I end up is with a piece of dense chocolate cake. It actually souffles too much. So I prefer doing this by hand. It keeps it simple, and especially if you're making this with kids, it just, yeah, keeps it all in the bowl. So see how shiny, smooth, and glossy that is? Now we'll add a little bit of vanilla because I'm using unsweetened chocolate. Most chocolates, bittersweet, semi-sweet even, have a little vanilla flavor added, but unsweetened chocolate there's no room for anything else in that chocolate other than that solid chocolate mass. So you need to add a touch of vanilla. If you want to start building in flavor, this is a great opportunity to add coffee extract or instant espresso grounds. You could add a little bit of orange zest, almond extract, peppermint extract. Any of those flavorings would get added now before you add your dry ingredients. And what I love is the dry ingredients are super, super simple. I do have a combination of all-purpose flour and cocoa powder. And I find this is where I have the most control, and you will too, in terms of achieving the right density, chewiness, and chocolate focus in your chocolate brownies. So for this recipe, I call for 150 grams or 1 cup of all-purpose flour and a 1/4 cup or 30 grams of cocoa powder. If you want to make them flourless, switch the measurements around, go more cocoa powder, and add some ground almonds just to give the brownies some structure and a break. They would actually be too intensely chocolatey if you just use straight cocoa powder. I don't bother when it comes to a brownie sifting my flour. We're not adding baking powder or baking soda because we're not making a cake. We're making a dense, fudgy brownie. So I stir that right in, but you always have to sift your cocoa powder. So if you're baking along and you need a chance to go run get your sifter, you can do that. I'm just going to use a small one just because of the fine grind of cocoa powder. It just has a tendency to clump. And just like that unsweetened chocolate, if you were to try and take a bite of this right now, it would be horrible. But I love that something so bitter can end up tasting so delicious. There we go. I'm just going to sift that in. Now I'm using Dutch processed cocoa powder, and you probably noticed in the recipe, I call for Dutch processed cocoa powder. If all you have is regular cocoa powder, just so long as it's unsweetened, that's absolutely fine. It's a small enough measurement. I just love Dutch process when I'm baking generally because Dutch processed cocoa involves a process of removing some of the acidity in the chocolate. And that unsweetened chocolate, when I tasted it on its own, was definitely acidic. This is more neutralized. It will have a deeper, richer, more mellow chocolate taste, and it lends a richer color to the brownie. So that's why I like using Dutch process. But don't feel you can't make this recipe if all you have is regular. Any chocolate beverage drink though, will not work because that's designed to be melted in a liquid and it's got the sugar added to it, and you won't find you get the chocolate intensity. Now, I had quite a few questions. I said I was going to talk about eggs, didn't I, when I was adding the eggs, and then I didn't. So I see your question. Oh, FA is just jumping in. What kind of flour was it? That was all-purpose flour. In UK, you would call it plain flour. It's important not to have baking powder in this recipe or it'll just rise up too much like a cake. But I had quite a few people, including P. Sharma was asking about egg substitutes. And they tried using the flaxseed egg substitutes in this recipe with not a lot of luck because it came out kind of dry and crumbly. Well, flaxseed being a seed ground, you soak it first. And if you are considering using the flaxseed substitute, for every 1 tablespoon of ground flaxseed, you soak it in 3 tablespoons of water for about a minute or two before you use it. You add it when you add the egg. But for something like a brownie, I would prefer using silken tofu. I love using soft tofu as an egg substitute. It's a protein, and when you whisk it or blitz it in a food processor, it becomes satiny smooth, the same consistency as an egg. For every 1 egg called for in a recipe, you would add 60 grams of whipped or whisked silken tofu. And I think you'll find with a smooth batter like this, in conventional cake batters, you'll find you have a great end result. It works in cheesecake too. So now I'm just whisking this until it's smooth. It still has a nice gloss to it. Oh, we're going to do a nice little close-up shot. Look at that. Excellent batter. Fantastic. Now I'm going to switch to the spatula, but before that, I need to grab my pecans to add in. So I'm going to count out some for the top of my pan. We're going to get 16 portions out of this, and the remaining pecans, I'll just give a coarse chop to. And as I'm doing that, let's take a look at some of the other options. So this is where you can get creative. You know your family's tastes. We've got the walnuts we talked about earlier. Dried fruits are excellent in a brownie. Chop up some dried apricots, cranberries, dried cherries. You can double up on the chocolate and add more chocolate chips at the end. This is praline candied hazelnuts chopped up. I personally love coconut in my brownies. Toffee bits, candied orange peel, pistachio, you name it. Dare I even say, oh, you're going to scream when I say this, prunes diced up in chocolate brownies are delicious. The rich, sweet taste of prunes against chocolate. Oh, I know you think I'm crazy. Just don't tell the kids you put the prunes in there, but it really is delicious. So I'm going to just roughly chop my pecans here. You can just really tell how tender they are. And I'll add this to the batter. You can chop them finely, coarsely, it's up to you. If you want to see them make a presence when you slice into the brownies. All right, a quick fold in. And I've preheated my oven to 350, that's 180 Celsius. Get these into my pan. And I could just feel I got chocolate on my hand there. You can't get away scot-free when you're making brownies. Never unscathed. This batter is a nice consistency. It'll find its way into the corners of the pan pretty easily. There we go. And then to mark my 16 portions, I'll just lay these 4 by 4 across the pan. If you're doing individual ones, you can put one on each. You don't have to bother if you don't want to. The nuts continue to toast, but because of the moisture of the brownie batter, they don't over toast, which is nice. So you don't have to, these still have that little bit of sea salt. If you're not doing the nuts, you could sprinkle a little sea salt right on top of the brownies themselves, the batter. Okay, and I'm going to pop this in the oven. I find if you're baking individuals, they take 20 minutes. Now, and as I said, if you're baking individual ones in a brownie pan or in a muffin tin, that's for people who love getting that kind of crunchy outside and soft center. For a square pan like this that will be portioned afterwards, you really do want to lend an extra 5-6 minutes. I did make a batch earlier. I set my timer and it was exactly 5 minutes more than the original 20 minutes in the stated in the recipe. So we're going to take a peek at those. Let's look at them in 20 minutes. But let's talk about how you can tell when brownies are done, because it really does depend on the recipe. The more eggs in the recipe, the wetter the batter will be, and the harder it is to check the doneness. So my general rule, and we'll give this a test when I pull these brownies out of the oven, is I use a bamboo skewer, or you can use a paring knife. And I check about 1 to 1.5 centimeters from the outside of the pan. And if I drop in the skewer and it comes out clean, I know I've got the heat and the brownies have been cooked through. And then I check the center. And if it's still got a little wetness to it, that's okay. But if you see some crumbs forming, then you know you've got that cooked outside to the brownie with the soft center. It really does, kind of like getting soft oatmeal cookies. It's a fine line between undercooking and overcooking. I do find you get a lot of experience when you do a recipe like this. The second time, you know exactly what you like out of your brownies. So you can keep cooking this recipe and make a more cake-like one as it cooks all the way through. And if you love that fudgy, almost soft center to the brownie, well, you're going to pull it from the oven a few minutes sooner. I'm just going to slide my laptop over so I can take some of your questions. I see we've got, oh, Jessica's taking notes. Good. You're going to make this tomorrow. That's excellent. Zoraida is asking about brands of butter. It depends. You said you live in Europe, which is many countries, of course, are known for their good quality butter. Unlike making a pastry like a croissant or a puff pastry dough where the fat content is so important, just a good unsalted butter gives you a predictable end result. So I would just opt for whatever your preferred brand is. With that amount of butter called for in this recipe, you will taste the quality difference. And that's another reason why I like to use unsalted butter in baking, is it just has a nice freshness and sweetness to it. Manisha is asking which oven I prefer, a microwave or a conventional oven. Well, I'll be honest, it's only because of space. We don't have a microwave in this house, so I have to even reheat things just using the conventional oven. I think the Western style of cooking is, the training is using a conventional oven. What I love is I'm expanding my repertoire and using our grill as more of a barbecue style oven, and learning how to steam more desserts too. So there's some great options out there. You're asking some great questions. Oh, here's a good one. And just as a note, because Finn is asking a question about gelatin versus agar. You don't have to ask me questions about brownies. We can use this 20 minutes to chat about any of your baking bothers, troubles, questions, what have you. So Finn was asking, what's the difference between gelatin and agar powder? Both serve the same function, and that is to set desserts like jellies, custards, and mousses. The difference is gelatin is not vegetarian and agar is vegan, in fact. And so the measurement when you're using it in a recipe, if you see a recipe call for gelatin and you are making the choice to use agar instead, the measurement is the same, gram for gram, volume for volume. It weighs exactly the same by volume. The difference is gelatin is first bloomed or softened in cool water, and then it's added to the hot liquid, usually after it's been cooked, just to melt it. Agar, being an algae, to thicken and activate, you don't need to soften it quite the same way, but it has to come to a full simmer. So if you're making a custard or a mousse base and you want to use the agar, you add it at the beginning of the process and you let that mixture come to a full simmer before you pull it off the heat, so that you get that same set if you're making a mousse cake you want to slice. So that was a great question to ask. Oh, Sherlin's asking a good brownie question. Can we refrigerate the brownie batter before baking? I see no reason why not. It will definitely change your bake time of the recipe. What potentially could happen is you almost end up with a molten center chocolate cake if you put it right from the fridge to the oven, you might set the outside and get more of a crust before the inside has had a chance to cook. So I would suggest if you want to make the batter ahead to bake fresh brownies, that you pull it out and let it sit out on the counter for a few hours just to let the ingredients soften up so it bakes more evenly. That said, baked brownies freeze wonderfully and they stay fresh for a long time. I find brownie recipes that call for melted chocolate as opposed to just cocoa powder will not dry out on the edges, where a cakier cocoa powder recipe might dry out a little bit. So you wrap them in an airtight container. I do like to store them generally in the fridge, but I like to eat them just not ice cold. So I pull them out a little bit before I plan on serving them. That's a very good question. Oh, Nora's asking, we were talking about gelatin and agar. Tapioca is another thickening agent. It is a plant-based starch. It has a stronger thickening power than cornstarch, which here in North America is probably the most common type. But now with flourless, gluten-free baking, tapioca is definitely more widely available. It is used more like cornstarch. And so it doesn't set something so much for slicing, but it does thicken things. And if you caught my pie dough 101 last week, I used tapioca starch to toss with my fruit for my fruit pie filling when I talked about making a strawberry rhubarb pie, because it thickens the juices as the pie bakes. So when you see cornstarch, you can also use tapioca in some circumstances. It does have more of a slippery consistency to it, so it's not my pick for lemon meringue pie, in case you were wondering. Oh, here, Oriel's cooking show. Hi, Oriel. Is it possible just to use melted chocolate and no cocoa powder in your brownies? I would say yes. And check out. There's so many recipes out there, and you can find those recipes that have been tested. Because this recipe only calls for 60 grams or a quarter cup, I think you could replace that with just simply more flour or ground almonds in place of it. I wouldn't increase the melted chocolate too much, but maybe maximum 30 grams, so an extra ounce in there. And you should get a consistent result if that's a choice for you. Oh, Eva's asking about creme brulee. So let's answer that question because you're asking it a lot. Maybe I should do an Oh Yum 101 on creme brulee or creme caramel, or ask you to pick a baked custard that we could do. Really, the secret behind creme brulee is that beautiful combination of egg yolks and cream with a water-based cooking method using a bain-marie. So I do have a fantastic recipe for a classic creme brulee right here on Oh Yum 101. If you want to reference that, the ratio is really nice. And I have a wicked recipe for creme caramel too, which is actually a little bit trickier to make because you're dealing with some whole eggs and not whipping cream in the recipe, but a combination of milk and a lighter cream. Oh, good, Trisha. So you tried the recipe and you know the creme brulee works. Oh, Enrique is asking, how do I achieve nice feet on macaron? We are really getting into 101 time. A good recipe, you'll find on this channel, I have a French macaron using the French method of just grinding almonds with icing sugar, whipping the meringue, combining the two. I do add a little meringue powder to that recipe. I have the Italian version, which involves cooking some of the sugar and adding to the egg whites. As a person who has a tendency to overfold her macaron, I prefer the Italian method. So if you're new to trying making macaron and you're trying to get that little ruffled edge at the bottom of the macaron, I have better luck with the Italian method. What you're doing, I don't know where you live, Enrique, but if the weather is humid, try and pick the least humid day possible and letting that macaron batter sit. On a humid day, I will give it up to 90 minutes, minimum 45 minutes. And you just use the top of your finger to touch after you've piped your batter and it spreads a little bit. You touch it after 45 minutes. If it's still sticky to the touch, you have to let it sit before you put it in the oven in order for that shell, that cap on top to form so that when your macaron bakes, it just kind of lifts up and that meringue kind of whoop, peeks out from the bottom, and that's how the foot develops. That was a great question. Okay. Oh, here's a good question. Ward is asking, why does a Swiss or Italian buttercream taste eggy? Well, egg whites are at the foundation of those two styles of buttercream. The Swiss, that you whisk sugar and egg whites together, then you take it off the heat, whip it, and you add your butter. An Italian buttercream, you whip your egg whites, you boil sugar, and you pour that into your mixer, and then add your butter. I find the ratio of egg whites in a Swiss buttercream will lend an egginess to it. I like to cook my egg whites when I heat them to 150 Fahrenheit, and you'll have to forgive me, I can't recall the Celsius conversion right off the top. I find that cooks without overcooking the egg whites, because if you cook them too far, you are setting the egg and you will get that egginess to them. So I would say if opt for the Swiss buttercream, but only bring them up to 150, and that makes them safe to handle. So another great question. Oh, Manisha is asking how to steam a perfect cake. Well, it really depends on the recipe, and you've got two options. If you've got a conventional oven, you can use a bain-marie, and that means you take a roasting pan, you fill whatever cake you're steaming, you fill it at least halfway with boiling water, and you want to cover that pan, and then you put it in the oven. If you're doing stovetop steaming in a bamboo steamer, well, you just steam away, but you want to try and avoid, you definitely don't want the water coming through the steamer itself. So it really only takes about 1 inch, 2.5 centimeters of water at the bottom of your pan with your steamer basket. I find very fluid batters and eggy batters steam very, very well. And I find you can often reduce the sugar in your steamed cakes. I took my traditional carrot cake recipe, like my dad's favorite carrot cake recipe, and I tried making it as a steamed individual dessert. And I found that I got a better result when I reduced the fat a little bit and I cut the sugar in half. And because of the steaming, it adds so much moisture, you get that soft, tender cake texture. Altogether different than a dry baked cake that gets a bit of a crust and browning to it. Oh, but so good. And with the spices and the carrot, and I added a little pineapple, it was a real treat. Buttercream questions. Well, we talked about Swiss and Italian, and then your other basic buttercream is it's sometimes called American or cupcake buttercream, where you simply beat butter and icing sugar with a little milk dissolved. That's the preferable buttercream if you're doing something like piping cupcakes. It takes color well, it's easiest to make, and then you don't have to worry about cooking egg whites or egg whites at all, quite frankly. And I'm afraid I can't tackle the question about cooking your brownies in a turbo broiler. Anything that is an accelerant, like cooking too quickly or too high a temperature, you would risk, because of the butter and the sugar in the brownies, might overcook it too quickly before the middle has had a chance to set. If you have a convection oven, so an oven with a fan, modern ovens factor in that temperature change, but if you have an older model of convection oven, you may find you do better by reducing the temperature by 25 degrees to get a good even cook, because all a convection fan does, and I don't know what this turbo broiler is, but it moves the hot air around the oven, which promotes browning. Fantastic if you're roasting potatoes. Wonderful if you're making bread like all of us are doing these days. Not as good when you're making something delicate like a cheesecake or brownies in this case. So you want to hold back on that temperature a little bit. Zoraida's asking, can I do a live show on plain pound cake, please? Well, that's a great thought too. We're always taking in account your questions and the style of questions and your ideas. And so as we move ahead planning new Yum 101 lives, we are factoring in your requests. And Also, remember, you can be looking to the Oh Yum 101 channel. You'll want to subscribe because new recipe videos release every Tuesday and Friday, and I can give you a sneak peek of what tomorrow's is. You will be able to learn how to make key lime pie. So, 9 a.m. Eastern time is the launch time for that brand new recipe. And if you watched Pie Dough Oh Yum 101 last week, you can even learn how to do the pie dough behind it. The key lime has a crumb crust, so you've got lots of options there. I'm going to check my time here. Oh, just 5 minutes. So that's enough time to handle a few more questions here. I'm just checking some of the previous ones. We're going to look at the brownies to tell when they're done. Oh, Jay Jenny asked a great question. She's tried this recipe. She's tried many others. And she keeps saying they're not like bakery brownies. Some bakeries will use vegetable oil or half oil, half butter in their brownies. And that can make them, if you really like a heavy brownie, it might make them a little heavier. If you find a commercial bakery brownie almost has a stickiness to it, they might use a liquid sugar, like a corn sugar or a glucose syrup in the brownie recipe because that helps keep it fresh for longer. So I don't know what texture or taste you're missing. Of course, different chocolates have different tastes to them, but that one has me curious. Makes me feel like I should go out and buy some brownies and do a little taste test. We've got a croissant question. Well, that was one of my very first Oh Yum 101 lives. Wow, I think I still have croissants in the freezer. Says my croissant were dense in the middle. So that to me says if they became more like bread, less like pastry, one of two things. They need to proof longer when they bake. So if you found that they baked and lots of butter came out of them, that's a sign they needed to rise a little bit longer. So then they hold in the butter when they hit the heat of the oven. If you didn't have the butter leak out of them and they were still bread-like in the center, I think it got over-folded and that butter just happened to work itself through a bit too much. So I hope you'll give them another try and look for those two factors that might help you along. That was a really good question to ask. Nuprita is asking about a buttermilk substitute for red velvet cake. Yes, if you don't have access to buttermilk, which is simply it is what's left from the butter making process naturally, it has an acidity to it. And so that's why it's called for in specific recipes because it activates your baking soda and your baking powder. For every 1 cup or 250 ml of buttermilk called for in a recipe, what you can do is measure out 1 cup of milk, pull away 1 tablespoon or 15 ml of milk and replace that with 1 teaspoon, 1 tablespoon, 15 ml of lemon juice. I prefer lemon juice over vinegar for the taste. You whisk that in, you let it sit for a second, and you'll notice the milk will start to curdle a little bit. And that's okay. That's what you want. And then you add it as the recipe calls for it. That was a fantastic question to ask. Good. You know what? Loop Cool. Oh, I love that handle. Wants to know how to make a cakey brownie. Well, we should talk about that because I've been talking about fudgy brownies because that's my preferred kind. People love cakey brownies. And I find when you want to frost a brownie, a cakey brownie can be even better and the better choice. To make a cakier brownie, you don't need to change anything in the recipe at all. Then you could make it using electric beaters to work some air into it, and I would add half a teaspoon of baking powder. That's the only difference that would need. And then I would give it an extra, for a square pan, I would give it an extra 8 minutes in the oven to really let it lift up and set. But all it will take is an extra bit of baking time and that half teaspoon of baking powder, and you will find beating with electric beaters, you'll get that fluffier, cakier brownie. Great question. I'm going to try and read this question. Italian buttercream, meringue, stiff peak, 30 grams of egg whites. Well, getting a stiff peak just takes time. You want to, when you're making Italian meringue, you put your egg whites in the mixer and you whip them until they're frothy. You have to make sure that your sugar hits 239 Fahrenheit before you gradually pour it in while you're whisking your whites. it's the sugar that gives those egg whites the structure. So cooking the sugar to that exact temperature is very, very important. Once you've added that volume of sugar to that, you said 30 grams of egg white. That's just one egg white. That's a small amount, but you need to keep whipping. You can't over whip once you've added that volume of cooked sugar, so you should be okay. So I hope that helps guide you through that process a little bit. Shan is asking, is it possible to use coconut sugar? Yes, 100%. I would use that in equal amounts. Now let's take a look at these brownies. Are you going to follow me to the oven? Excellent. There we go. So you can see in the corners, there's a little lift. So this is where to check the doneness. Oh my gosh, they smell amazing. I dropped my skewer in. Oh, there's a pecan. And see how it's still got a little moisture to it. I'm going to put that back in the oven just for another 3-4 minutes. When this pulls away a little more cleanly, then I'll know that the brownies have enough cook time to them that they will be cooked on the outside, still have that fudgy center to them. So let's give this another 3 minutes. But in the meantime, let me switch over. I know everybody's got things to do. I thank you for spending an hour with me today, walking through brownies. For those of you who have baked along with me, how are your brownies coming along? They probably need a couple more minutes too, I bet. So here's a batch I made just a couple hours ago, still at room temperature. And now this, you can see why I like the parchment. It's easy to pull out of the container. And let's cut through so we can look at the inside. So you've got that moisture and that density, but you've got this sort of crispy crust. I didn't get the crackle, I'll admit. But I like, when it comes to a brownie, I like an end piece because I like a bit of the crunch on the outside and I like that soft center. And I know there are people that go right for that center piece. So you've got a nice fudginess. This still is soft. If you chill this, you'll find it sets up a little more. So if you like more of the chew, I would refrigerate the brownies and then slice them. If you like more of that soft, melty tenderness, then stick with the brownies at room temperature, but do store them chilled. I'm not going to take a bite quite yet, just because I know I'm going to get chocolate everywhere, but I will take a bite at the very end. Why don't I get these on a plate? We're just giving those brownies in the oven a couple extra minutes. And I hope everyone is doing well. I thank you for your support. We've really grown such a wonderful audience through this Oh Yum 101 live session. And it's been a great way to connect with you live and be able to talk our way through these recipes. And it's because of your support that we have risen above 800,000 subscribers. So thank you. Thank you for your support. And this is what keeps me baking. You keep me inspired to create new recipes, new dishes, share what I've learned along the way. So sometimes it's a bake along. Sometimes I'll guide you through the step-by-step process. But I am working on some fantastic new recipes. And we're going to plan on having new content coming to you all the time. Exciting new tastes and flavors. Yeah, that stack of brownies looks okay. Oh, okay. Thank you for pointing that out. Michael just mentioned the question on storing the brownies. So yes, you can store them in an airtight container. This recipe I find does not dry out. You won't get that sort of dried out edge where you cut your brownies. Ultimately, I prefer storing them in the fridge. It's just easier. And then pull them out and let them sit out for about 15 minutes before you take a bite. So you'll find you get a longer shelf life. If you store them in an airtight container, they're good for about 2 to 3 days. But if you store them in the fridge, you'll get 5 to 7 days. But has a batch of brownies ever lasted 7 days? I don't think so. Okay, let's take one more before I sign off. Let's take a final look at these brownies coming out of the oven. So this is, made these right in front of you, start to finish. Yeah, and I've got more, the shine is gone. So I've got some crumbs, and then I'll just compare that to the center, which should be softer and gooier. Yes, there's a shine there. So I've got that contrast of the dry, matte looking crumble at the edge versus the soft center. So this is where I want to put these out to cool completely. And then Lucky Bonnie down the street knows that I'm going to pop her a note in a few minutes and come by with a little brownie delivery. So thank you once again, everyone, for joining me here at Oh Yum 101 Live. And stay with the community because we'll be putting out the poll for what to vote on for next week's tutorial. See you then.